The notary looked up from the document, set down his pen, and said the words my son-in-law had never expected to hear. "I'm sorry. The signature on this power of attorney doesn't match the one on file. We can't proceed." My daughter looked at him sharply. "What do you mean it doesn't match?" He turned the papers toward her. "The signature your husband provided doesn't correspond with the registered owner's signature on record with the province." My son-in-law's face went pale. He started to speak, then stopped. Then looked toward the door, because that's when I walked in. I hadn't spoken to either of them in 4 months. Not since the night they handed me a box of my belongings and told me I should probably think about finding somewhere better suited to a man my age. My daughter said it gently, the way people say painful things when they've rehearsed them enough times that the edges go smooth. My son-in-law didn't say much at all. He'd gotten good at that. Standing in that notary's office, watching the color leave his face, I felt no victory, just something quieter. A kind of tired relief that comes when a long winter finally breaks. But to understand how we got to that office, you need to know what happened the Thanksgiving before. My name is Kenneth Marsh. I'm 68 years old. I live in a small city called Guelph, Ontario, though I grew up further north, outside of Sudbury, where my father worked in the mines and my mother kept a garden that survived. Things gardens have no business surviving. I spent 32 years as a licensed electrician. Journeyman first, then master, eventually running my own small contracting business. Nothing that made me rich, just enough that I never had to ask anyone for anything, and I was proud of that in the stubborn, quiet way that men from northern Ontario tend to be proud of things. My wife, Joanna, I always called her Jo, passed away 7 years ago. Ovarian cancer. She fought it for 2 years with a kind of dignity that made everyone around her feel ashamed of their own small complaints. When she died, the house in Guelph went silent in a way I hadn't understood was possible. 41 years of marriage leaves a particular shape in a home. And when the person who made that shape is gone, you spend a lot of time walking into rooms and forgetting why you came. I managed. You do. Our daughter had moved away after university, married a man named Trent, who worked in commercial real estate and settled in a suburb of Hamilton. She's our only child. We'd wanted more, but it hadn't worked out that way. And so all the love Jo and I had to give went to her, and later to her 2 kids, our grandchildren, a girl of 12 now and a boy of 9. They are the kind of children who make you believe the world might be all right after all. A few years after Jo passed, my daughter called me with an idea. Trent had an opportunity. A property flip, he said. He'd found a house in a good neighborhood in Burlington that needed significant work. Electrical, plumbing, foundation repairs, and he wanted to move quickly before someone else did. The issue was capital. He was extended on another project, and the bank needed a cosigner. I want to be careful here because I've told this story a few times to a few people, and I always try to be fair. Trent isn't a villain in the way villains appear in stories. He's a man who got used to a certain way of doing things, who learned early that charm could open doors that effort couldn't, and who had simply never been told no by anyone who mattered to him. My daughter made the call herself, which I should have noticed. She said the words. She said, "Dad, we really need you, and I love you, and you'd be helping the grandchildren." And all of it was true enough that I didn't look at what was also true underneath it. I co-signed the loan, $340,000. That's a significant amount of money. In Ontario, in a market like Burlington, it isn't unusual for a renovation project. I understood the risk. I was 63 at the time. My contractor's pension was modest. I had some savings, the equity in the Guelph house, and an RRSP I'd been careful with for 30 years. If the deal went wrong, I couldn't simply absorb the loss and move on. Trent knew that. My daughter knew that. I believe they considered it and decided the risk was mine to carry. The flip didn't fail. That's important to understand. It succeeded. Trent sold the Burlington property 11 months later for a profit of roughly $190,000 after expenses. I was paid back the loan, which had been used as a down payment. I was not offered a percentage of the profit, though my credit and my name had made the deal possible. I didn't say anything about it. That was my first mistake among several. 6 months after the Burlington sale, My daughter called again. This time the offer was different. They were expanding into a larger home. The kids needed space. The schools were better further out. Trent had his eye on a place in Ancaster, and they suggested that instead of selling my Guelph house, I might consider moving in with them, not as a tenant, as family. Jo's voice was very present in my mind that week. She'd always been the one who could see around corners. I remember sitting in the garden she'd planted 20 years ago, the one I'd kept up because letting it go felt like giving something away I wasn't ready to give, and thinking about what she would have said. She probably would have asked one question: "Kenneth, what is it you actually want?" What I wanted was to see my grandchildren grow up. What I wanted was to not be a man who rattled around a quiet house until he forgot how to talk to people. What I wanted, though I didn't say it aloud, was to still feel useful. So I said yes. What they didn't know, what I didn't tell them, because it simply never came up, was that I hadn't sold my Guelph house. I'd transferred it into a numbered company my accountant had set up years earlier for exactly these kinds of situations: tax planning, liability protection, estate purposes. Standard practice for a self-employed tradesperson in Ontario. The house was owned by 2247891 Ontario Inc., and I was the sole director. My name appeared nowhere in the public record as the individual owner. When people asked, I said I'd made arrangements and left it there. I moved into the Ancaster house in October. My daughter put me in a room on the main floor, near the back. It had its own bathroom and a window that looked out on the backyard, which was large and had a tree the grandchildren liked to climb. For the first few months, things were genuinely warm. I fixed things that needed fixing: a bathroom fan, a gate latch, the garage door sensor that had been stuck since they moved in. I drove the kids to school when schedules were tight. I made soup on Sunday afternoons because Jo used to, and because the smell made the house feel occupied in a way I liked. Trent was cordial. He worked long hours and wasn't home much, and when he was, conversations tended to stay on surfaces: hockey, the weather, the neighborhood. My daughter seemed happy, lighter, somehow, than she'd been in years. I told myself we'd found something that worked. Then winter came. I'm not sure exactly when it started. That's the honest answer. It didn't announce itself. It accumulated. There were comments. Not cruel at first, not even pointed. Just the kind of thing you file away and don't mention. Trent saying, over dinner, that the soup was a bit salty twice, as if the second time were a policy announcement. My daughter mentioning that the grandchildren needed their routine protected during the week, so perhaps I could do the school drop-offs only on Thursdays. The guest bathroom, which they'd told me to treat as my own, began appearing with a small sign asking that personal items be stored after use. Small things. I told myself that families find their rhythms. By spring, the rhythm had changed. Trent started spending weekend mornings with spreadsheets at the kitchen table, papers spread wide, occasionally making phone calls in a voice he turned down when I entered the room. My daughter was often out, or busy, or in the middle of something. The grandchildren's schedules filled with activities: hockey for the boy, competitive dance for the girl. And the Sundays I'd spent reading with them in the living room became rarer, then rare, then mostly memories. One afternoon in April, I was sitting on the back porch with my coffee when I heard Trent inside talking on the phone. The kitchen window was open. I hadn't intended to listen. I was just sitting there with my mug watching a robin argue with something in the grass. Then I heard him say, "The Guelph property could be what closes the gap." I set down my mug. His voice dropped, but not enough. "She said she thinks he sold it before he moved here, but I don't think he did. I think it's still there. If we can get him to sign a transfer authorization, we're talking another asset at current market value." A pause. "He'll do it. He's always done whatever she's asked." I sat with that for a long time after he went inside. The robin flew away. The yard went quiet. I thought about what Jo used to say about the difference between being generous and being taken for granted, and how she believed it was possible to be so practiced at one that you stopped noticing you'd crossed into the other. That evening, my daughter asked if we could talk after dinner. She said Trent had some thoughts about financial planning. She said it the way you say something you've rehearsed enough times that you believe you've made it sound natural. I told her sure. we could talk. What followed over the next several weeks was careful and patient, and I think genuinely believed by my daughter to be reasonable. They were thinking about their retirement. The real estate market in Hamilton was shifting. If I wasn't doing anything with the Guelph house, it might make sense to consolidate. They could manage the sale. I wouldn't have to deal with any of the paperwork. I nodded and listened and asked a few questions and didn't commit to anything. Then I called my accountant. His name is Martin. We've known each other since the mid-90s when he helped me set up the business. He listened to what I told him, asked a few questions, and then said, "Ken, they can't sell that property without you. The company is yours. Your signature is required for any disposition of assets. Full stop." "I know," I told him. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to make sure the records are clean, in case someone goes looking?" "Yes," I said. And then I told him one thing more. He was quiet again. Then he said, "All right, Kenneth, whenever you're ready." Summer arrived. The tension in the house shifted from background noise to something that took up space in rooms. Trent stopped trying to be cordial. My daughter began doing the thing that hurts more than anger. She began being sad around me, quietly, visibly, in ways that invited me to ask what was wrong, but never quite crossed into accusation. I asked her, one evening in July, whether she wanted to tell me what was actually going on. She said she was just tired. I said, "Are we all right, you and I?" She looked out the window. "Of course, Dad." That pause, before she looked away, told me everything the words didn't. The grandchildren remained my constant. The boy had started asking me about electrical work, genuinely curious the way 9-year-old boys can be when something captures them. We'd sit in the garage sometimes, and I'd show him how circuits worked, the theory behind it, why certain things fail. His questions were good. My daughter's daughter was different, quieter, more watchful, the kind of child who notices things and stores them away. She found me one evening, reading in my room, and sat on the floor without saying anything, just leaning against the bookshelf the way teenagers sometimes announce they want company without wanting to ask for it. "Grandpa, are things weird here?" I considered several answers. Then I said, "Sometimes families go through things." She picked at a loose thread on her sock. "Mom and Dad argue about you when they think we can't hear." I didn't ask what was said. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Instead, I told her that people sometimes argue about things they don't know how to talk about directly, and that it didn't mean anyone was wrong to love someone. She looked up at me. "They're not being fair to you." Coming from a 12-year-old delivered with no drama and no performance, just flat certainty. It was the kindest and hardest thing anyone said to me that year. Thanksgiving came in October, the way it does in Canada. My daughter had her mother-in-law and 2 of Trent's brothers over, plus their families. 12 people in a house built for 6. I helped set up tables, cooked the squash because nobody else wanted to, tried to stay useful. Midway through dinner, Trent's older brother asked how retirement was treating me. Before I could answer, Trent said with a smile pointed at the table, "He's got it pretty comfortable. Rent-free, someone else's grocery bill." A few people laughed, the polite kind. His mother said something about how nice it was for families to look after each other. I smiled and kept eating. My daughter didn't look at me. She busied herself refilling a water glass. I looked at her for a moment, just a moment, waiting. She kept her eyes down. Not because she agreed with what her husband said. Because she decided, somewhere in the last several months, that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping the family together. I understood it. I didn't forgive it. Not yet. But I understood it. By November, I had already spoken again with Martin. We'd made certain preparations. I'd also contacted a notary public I knew through an old client in Guelph and had a conversation with him about what to watch for if someone approached him with a power of attorney document related to any property held by my numbered company. He called me on a Tuesday in late November. "Someone came in today," he said. "Man named Trent, brought a POA form, said his father-in-law had authorized him to manage a real estate transaction. I told him I'd need to verify the signature on file. And it didn't match. I sat in my room for a long time after that call. Snow was coming down outside, the first real snow of the season, the kind that sticks. I thought about my daughter. I thought about what it must have taken for her to agree to this, or whether she'd agreed at all, whether she even knew. I thought about 32 years of early mornings and cold job sites, and the retirement savings that had been built carefully, the way you build something when you know there's no one to catch you if it falls. And I thought about the fact that my son-in-law had taken a document with a forged signature to a notary public and tried to transfer an asset that wasn't his. I called Martin. I told him it was time. The next morning, I drove to a solicitor's office in Hamilton. Her name was Janet, and she was sharp and unhurried and did not waste words. We reviewed everything. She confirmed what Martin had already told me. No transaction involving the Guelph property could occur without my authorization. The POA attempt had failed, and I had grounds for something considerably more serious if I chose to pursue it. I told her I didn't want to pursue it. I wanted to handle this quietly. She looked at me over her reading glasses the way lawyers look at people who are choosing the harder thing when the easier thing is available. "That's your call," she said. "But quietly doesn't mean without consequence." No, I agreed. It didn't. I didn't go home that night. I drove instead to a small inn near Waterloo that Joe and I used to visit when the kids were young, back when a weekend away was the most luxury we could justify. I got a room. I ordered soup from the restaurant downstairs. I watched the snow settle over the parking lot and let myself feel, quietly and completely, what I'd been not feeling for the better part of a year. The betrayal wasn't Trent. Not really. I'd seen Trent clearly enough from the beginning. The betrayal was the silence. My daughter had stood at enough tables, in enough rooms, while her husband said things that diminished me, and she had chosen, each time, not to speak. That's not cruelty. It's something in some ways harder to sit with. It's the slow accumulation of small choices made by someone you love. I thought about Joe. I always think about Joe when things get hard. She would have had no patience for sentiment in a moment like that one. She would have said, "Kenneth, you didn't raise her to make small choices. Go home and say what needs saying." I checked out the next morning and drove to Ancaster. My daughter was in the kitchen when I came in. She looked up from her coffee and seemed to understand immediately, the way people sometimes do, that something had changed. The house was quiet. Trent was at work. The kids were at school. I sat down across from her. I told her what I knew. Not in anger, not with a list or an accusation or a volume of evidence. I just told her what had happened, in order, from the beginning. The phone call I'd overheard in April, the conversations about the Guelph property, the notary's call. What a forged signature on a power of attorney document means, legally, in Ontario. She didn't interrupt me. She didn't deny anything. She sat very still and looked at her hands. And by the time I finished, there were tears running down her face. Not the dramatic kind, just the quiet overflow of someone who has finally been made to see clearly what they'd been choosing not to look at. "I didn't know about the signature," she said. I believed her. "But you knew about the rest." She didn't answer that, which was its own answer. I told her what would happen next. I was moving back to Guelph. The house was mine, and it would stay mine. If Trent wished to speak with Janet about the POA document, that was available to him. I was not interested in involving the police, not yet. Not if things were handled with some honesty from here forward. She asked if we could still be family. I looked at her for a moment. She's 61 years in the future of the daughter I held in a hospital in Sudbury in the middle of a February blizzard, and sometimes when she looks a certain way, I can still see the baby in her face. Love doesn't dissolve. It just sometimes has to learn new boundaries. "I don't know yet," I said. "That depends on what gets chosen going forward." I packed what I'd brought to Ancaster. It fit into my truck in 2 trips. My granddaughter was home early that day, early release. Something to do with the teacher's meeting, and she met me in the hallway while I carried out the second load. She didn't ask where I was going. She already knew. She just hugged me in that full-armed way kids do when they mean it, with their whole bodies. I held on for a moment. Then I drove north. The first few months in Guelph were strange. Not bad, just unfamiliar. The house had been rented through a property management company while I'd been in Ancaster, and the tenants had moved out in September. The garden was overgrown. The guest room smelled like a house that had been lived in by strangers. I opened windows, aired things out, and spent 2 weekends in November getting things back in order. My grandson called me in December, out of nowhere. He said he was working on a school project about jobs and trades, and could he ask me some questions? We talked for 40 minutes. At the end, he said, "Grandpa, I told my teacher my grandpa was an electrician, and she said that's the most important job in a house." I told him I thought his teacher was pretty smart. My daughter texted a few times, short messages, careful. She asked if I was settled. She said the kids were asking about me. She didn't mention Trent. I answered briefly and warmly and let things rest. Then, in late January, she called. It was a Saturday evening. I'd been reading by the fire. I'd gotten the fireplace going again for the first time in years, and when her name appeared on my phone, I sat with it for a moment before I picked up. She said, "Trent is seeing a counselor." She said it the way someone announces something they're not sure you'll believe. He told the counselor what he tried to do. What he tried to do. I said, "Okay. He hasn't told me everything yet, but he will." I didn't say much after that. I let her talk. She talked for a while. She said things she'd never said before, about how scared she'd been, how much of the last year she'd spent trying to hold things together by giving Trent what he wanted, how she'd convinced herself that going along with the plan was just financial strategy, not what it actually was. She said, "I kept telling myself it was still your money if it was our household." Her voice broke a little on that sentence. "That's not how it works. I know that." "No," I said quietly, "it isn't." She asked if she could bring the grandchildren to see me in the spring. Not Trent, not yet, just her and the kids. I said yes. February in Guelph is a particular kind of cold, gray and close and long. I've lived here most of my adult life, and I've never entirely made my peace with February. But there's something about having a house that is entirely and unambiguously yours, about walking through quiet rooms in the morning and knowing that nothing in them has been negotiated or contested or quietly maneuvered over. That makes even February feel manageable. I started volunteering at a trades program at a local high school. They needed people with working experience to come in and talk to the students. And I found I was glad to go. The teacher who ran the program was a serious young woman who had herself been an apprentice plumber before moving into education. She knew what she was doing. The students were the usual mix. Some engaged, some skeptical, one or two who were clearly there because a parent had insisted. But every now and then, one of them would ask a question that reminded me why the trades matter. Why working with your hands on something real, something that either works or doesn't, teaches a person things that nothing else can. Spring arrived in April, a little early that year. The garden came back, as it always does. Joe planted things that were meant to persist, and most of them have. My daughter came on a Saturday in May with both grandchildren. We spent the day outside. I showed my grandson some of what I'd fixed in the electrical panel, walked him through it slowly. He followed along with a seriousness that made me smile. My granddaughter helped me replant the front bed, the one that had gone to weeds over the winter. She worked steadily and didn't complain about the dirt. At some point, she looked up at me with a streak of mud on her cheek and said, "This is better, Grandpa. Here." I didn't ask what she meant by that. I knew what she meant. My daughter and I sat on the back porch while the kids played at the far end of the yard. We talked for a long time, longer than we'd talked in years, about real things, about her mother, about what it had been like to watch Joe die, about choices she'd made that she wished she hadn't, about what she wanted her life to look like going forward. I didn't offer advice. I just listened. At the end of the afternoon, before they left, she hugged me in the driveway for longer than usual. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said. "Not for anything specific, or maybe for all of it." "I know," I said, which was the truest answer. Trent and I spoke on the phone in July. It was brief and uncomfortable and honest, which is probably the right combination for a conversation like that. He said he'd made choices he couldn't defend. He didn't try to explain them away. He said he didn't expect me to trust him, and he understood if I never did. I told him I appreciated the call. I meant it, though I wasn't ready to mean much more than that. Trust takes time, in both directions. The damage done to it doesn't simply convert to repair because someone says the right words. But the words, said honestly, are where it starts. By summer, I had settled into something that felt, for the first time in years, like an actual life, not recovery, not patience, not endurance. Life. Morning coffee, the garden, the trades program, a fishing trip in August with my cousin up near Parry Sound that I hadn't made time for in 15 years. The lake was cold and clear and the fish were cooperating, and we didn't talk about much of anything that mattered, which was exactly what I needed. One evening that September, sitting on the back porch with the light going golden over the garden, I thought about what I would say to a younger version of myself. The man who co-signed the loan because his daughter asked and he wanted to feel useful. The man who moved into the Ancaster house because loneliness is real and grandchildren are real and wanting to matter to someone is as real as anything. I wouldn't tell him not to do it. I don't think that's the lesson. I think the lesson is this. Being generous and being taken advantage of aren't opposites. You can be both at the same time, and it isn't your fault for being generous. But the moment you begin to see what's happening, you owe it to yourself, not out of pride, not out of anger, but out of the same self-respect you'd ask of anyone you loved, to stop handing people the tools they're using against you. Joe always said that kindness without boundaries isn't kindness. It's just endurance with a nicer name. She was right about most things. She was definitely right about that. There's a photograph of her on the mantle, taken in the late 90s, somewhere on Georgian Bay. She's laughing at something outside the frame, the way she always was. Something was always catching her attention, drawing her toward it. I still talk to her sometimes, old habit. I tell her how the garden is doing. I tell her about the grandchildren. I tell her that I've learned some things late, but not too late, and that I think she'd be glad to know it. The hardest thing about the last 2 years wasn't the money. It wasn't the house or the legal complication or any of the tangible parts of the story. The hardest thing was learning that love, real, long-built, bone-deep love, doesn't protect you from betrayal, and that discovering you've been betrayed by someone you love doesn't mean you love them less. It just means you have to learn, maybe for the first time, what it looks like to love someone and also require better from them. That's not a lesson I'd have chosen. But I'm grateful, slowly and honestly, that I finally learned it.